Welcome. I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Centre, sponsored by Small Church Connections here in Canada. And this is us, Canadian Small Churches in Action podcast. Well, today we have a very special guest with us. I've been looking forward to this. I've just read a book that he has put out. Well, he's put out a whole bunch of books, but the latest book that I have, I've just read it and enjoyed it immensely. If that's not a good start without telling you who on earth this is, here we go. I'm going to let him introduce himself and maybe just a little bit of his ministry journey over the few years that he has been alive. Let's just leave it at that. Take it away, Rod.
Thank you, Ron. Well,
You're
it's
welcome.
lovely to be with you. And yeah, I guess we share hair color together. So
Isn't that great?
yes, yeah, it does mean we probably have a lot of years in ministry. Yeah. So no, it's lovely to be with you, and thank you for the invitation. My journey started in Dublin, in Ireland. I was born in Dublin and emigrated to Canada with my parents when I was a child. Lived around the Toronto area for most of my life, and then moved here to Vancouver 22 years ago. So I've been on a journey west, and I'm hoping for beach ministry in Fiji next is what I hope the next Western journey is.
You're going to walk on water on your way over there, right?
Yeah. So, when I look back now, Ron, it's funny looking back at your life. When you're in your 20s, you're sort of looking forward. But when I look back on my life now, I experienced it as a life of vocational confusion, is probably what I would describe it as. I've really enjoyed the so-called secular world and working in that. So I originally started as a psychologist. So I have a doctorate in clinical psychology, and I worked in that field for a number of years. And then I've always been interested in the integration of theology and psychology. So I did a theological degree after the PhD. And then I've worked in psychological settings in clinics and hospitals and those kinds of things. Have been a pastor in 3 different churches, and I've worked a fair bit in theological education. Our journey out to Vancouver 22 years ago was to be President of Regent College, which I did for 15 years. And when I left that 7 years ago, I just felt a real call to work with leaders. So the last 7 years, I've been walking alongside leaders around the world, mostly in churches and nonprofits, and I've just enjoyed that immensely. I don't think we have enough conversation these days. We have a lot of conferences and podcasts and, various YouTube and all the rest, but just good old conversation. I feel like a lot of leaders don't have space for that or don't have opportunities for it. So I've enjoyed that the last 7 years. Married to Bev, just celebrated 45 years of marriage, and have a 35-year-old daughter who is probably the place I've learned the most about the gospel. She's had multiple disabilities and lots of struggles and lots of pain in our life, and probably like a lot of your listeners. And often it seems those of us in ministry roles, our family angst and pain is where we learn the most about the gospel. So that's probably, I said to my daughter recently, I said, I've learned more about God from you than anything else I've done. And she said, I'm an atheist. I don't even believe in God. How can that be true? And I said, well, I don't know, but it is. So that's the capsule summary of me, Ron.
Well, I could go into a whole bunch of areas there. I also lived in Toronto for a few years in my high school years, and actually in a little town called Unionville, just outside of Toronto.
Yes.
And it was a good training ground. And then coming back to rural churches, I've noted that rural and urban are different. And most rural churches, and I would have to say most small churches, are very relational. The program thing happens in the parking lot.
Yeah.
And so how do you see, okay, I'm going to hold up your book just so people see. I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm reading it backwards. Tell me now. Tell me more. Tell me more. Yes.
Yeah.
How do you see the insights from your book maybe helping a small church leadership and those within the small church?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that concerned me, Ron, which really led me to write this book, was it feels to me like in the church world, we have not overvalued our relationship with God. I think that would be the wrong emphasis. But I think in our emphasis on our relationship with God, we often forget that the way God created us and the way the command goes, we need to love God with all our heart and soul and mind and strength, but we also need to love each other. And our relationships with one another strikes me as where some of our problems are right now. And I think in the pandemic, we've seen all kinds of conflict and tension and fights and arguments. A lot of pastors are having to deal with this. So I wanted to write a book that really focused on the horizontal responsibility we have as Christians to converse with one another and to be in relationship with one another. So these three phrases, thank you, I'm sorry, tell me more. I've just moved into my 8th decade recently, which means I'm 70.
Yeah.
And I was looking back in my life and thinking the people who really were relational and focused on relationships, what was their life like? And I concluded that they were people who said, thank you, I'm sorry, and tell me more frequently.
Mhm.
And the people who didn't do that very much were people who really lacked relationally. They may have a high spirituality and they may have a great love for scripture and teaching it and listening to it, but often their relationships were wanting. So I think in small churches, one of the things that's very, very clear is the opportunity for genuine relational connection is much higher. I love the notion that bigger is not better, and I think in these large impersonal environments, we become more anonymous, we become more independent, we become more autonomous, and we actually forget the people around us. And so many people are walking into church on a Sunday morning and walking out and think they've done their due diligence spiritually, but
Yeah.
in reality, I think in a small church, the average church in North America, as you know, is under 100 people, and there's
Yes.
much greater likelihood to have solid relationships when you're dealing with 100 people than when you're dealing with 1,000.
Well, I must admit, the relationships are solid in that you can't get away from them in a smaller church. So you're solidly connected. The question is, how do you
Yeah,
go about making sure that the relationships are vibrant
yeah,
instead of destructive?
yeah.
And maybe you can expand a little bit on the three phrases that you've used and give us a little bit of thought about how we can have vibrant relationship.
Yeah, one of the things that I do in the book, as you know, is I look at the culture, and I think we're living in a cultural time right now that's filled with entitlement. And for me, the
Yes.
best summary of entitlement is I deserve it. So, marketing and advertising and all the things that go on in the culture, the message I get, even as a baby boomer, like I'll watch a television program and some commercial comes on and says, you deserve this.
Yeah.
Well, when I bring entitlement and a deserving posture to life, I don't understand that the antidote to that is gratitude. It's not that I deserve things, but I need to be thankful for things that come my way. So I think a practice of gratitude, a practice of saying thank you can offset that cultural entitlement, I deserve it thing. And then the second one, I'm sorry. I think we're living in a culture of victimization,
Mm.
and in a culture of victimization, the underlying sentence is, "It's not my fault."
Right.
So everybody's blaming this and blaming that, and it's not me; it's somebody else's fault. But the antidote to "it's not my fault" and victimization is "I'm sorry." Biblically, we would call it repentance. I call it remorse in the book, where we acknowledge that we do impact other people negatively. We're not always victimized. We are the perpetrator of problems in other people's lives sometimes, and we need to apologize for that. And then the third one, I think we're living in such an individualistic culture where my story matters most. What's going on in my life matters most. So, you and I are in a coffee shop together, and like, it's what's most important is Rod, not Ron. Like, I don't want
Yeah.
to hear from you. I want to tell you my story. But that individualism where we get preoccupied with ourselves means we don't say, Ron, like, tell me more. Tell me more about this. Like, you went to high school in Unionville, that was very formative for you. Tell me more about that. In what way? And when we engage in that kind of care of other people, we're offsetting this cultural individualism that seems so prominent right now. So my view, like for me, it's just being a Christian, like you look at the cultural trend and you don't always fight it. I mean, I worry about that. Sometimes people think the Christian response to culture is you have to fight it all the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
I think you need to embody an alternative. So for me, like entitlement needs to be responded to with gratitude, and victimization needs to be responded to with remorse, and individualism needs to be responded to with care. And if I really get that, then I'll say, thank you, I'm sorry, tell me more, a lot more than I do.
So within a local church, maybe we need to have times of community that we'll call holy community, where we actually talk to each other and say thank you and say I'm sorry and say, now tell me a little bit more about what's going on in life.
Yeah.
Would there be, how else might a small church approach that type of, let's have a different atmosphere? Because there are difficult small churches that I'll just let you play with that thought.
No, I think it's really important, and the word I would use is vigilance. That when I go to church, I'm not just going passively or going to listen or going to receive. Like I think often we become sort of the object when we go to church, like other things are being done for us. But if the mindset is, other people impact me positively, and I impact some other people negatively, and we impact each other. Like if I'm really vigilant about that, then I go to church on Sunday morning and I say, who's doing things today that I really appreciate? So maybe it's the way somebody communicates from the pulpit. Maybe it's the way an usher responds. Maybe it's the way somebody set up communion. Maybe it's the way somebody showed care for a little child in the parking lot. And just to acknowledge that and say thank you. For many of us, it won't happen spontaneously. I think a lot of us need the vigilance to say, who can I thank today? And then to do that inventory. I mean, it's very much what Jesus talked about in Matthew, like before you bring your gift to the altar, like, check yourself out. Are you in a poor relationship with somebody? And do you need to apologize and say you're sorry to someone? And then to have the vigilance to say, when I bump into Ron in the parking lot and I say to Ron, so how was your week? And he said, well, it was okay. It wasn't that great. Do I say, oh, I'm sorry? Or do I say, tell me more? Like, help me understand that. And what amazes me, Ron, and, these phrases are so simple. Thank you, I'm sorry, tell me more. But what amazes me is where they lead us. Just a quick story. I was my wife and I were in Florida at a conference a number of years ago. And I love dessert. I just consider the first course. I don't like.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
The Nanaimo bars are my favorite. We're good.
There you go. So, I don't like the first course being called the first course. Like for me, the main course is dessert and the first course is simply foundational.
Oh, definitely.
So when I'm in a restaurant and the waiter or the waitress comes over and says, would you like dessert? I always say to them, is the Pope Catholic? And, and sort of, obviously the Pope's Catholic. So of course I want dessert. Like, well, what other options are there? So this young girl came to the table. We'd finished our main course, and she said, "Would you like dessert?" And I said, "Is the Pope Catholic?" And she said, "Is he?" And I said, "Tell me more." And she said, "Well, like I don't know who the Pope is. Like, what's the Pope? I mean, what's Catholic?" So we had this 20-minute conversation at the table about religion, about different groups, about her upbringing, where she had here she is in Florida, in a major center, no exposure to Christian faith, no exposure to Catholicism, no understanding of spirituality. And she said, like, what are you here for? And I said, well, we're here for a Christian conference. Oh, what's that? No, like just no reference.
No sense, eh?
No. And what was interesting to me in God's bigger economy was, I believe, I mean, I didn't get her name. I've, never followed up with her, but I think that probably was a little piece in the chain of her journey to God.
Mhm.
Just my simple little funny line, is the Pope Catholic? And then me saying, tell me more. If I just laughed when she said, is he? Nothing would have happened, but it gave
Yeah.
us an opportunity. And so we all carry stories around, right? Like in small churches, if you've got
Mm.
96 people in your church, there's 96 stories
Yeah.
there. And behind every behavior and every look and every attitude, there's a story. So, if I was in your church and you were celebrating Father's Day, and you looked over at me and you came over and said, Rod, like, how are you doing today? I would say, I'm okay.
Mhm.
And if you said, oh, I'm sorry, I'll pray for you. That would be okay. That's about a C+ response.
Yeah.
If you said, tell me more, I would say Father's Days is one of the most painful days in the calendar year for me because of all the pain we've had with our daughter.
Mhm.
So like everyone's all happy and up about Father's Day. It's a painful day for me, but you'll only know that if you say, tell me more. So I think the vigilance of going to church and thinking, who can I thank? Who can I apologize to? Who can I say, tell me more? Just brings this relationality to the surface and makes for a better community in the church.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let me just jump in with a semi rabbit trail here.
Yeah.
Uh, when I think of our culture and how much it's changed, and you've just illustrated, you know, when I was growing up, I'm a boomer about your age as well.
Yeah.
If I talked about the Pope, everybody knew who the Pope was. That was just how how are we how are we listening to our culture? What is our culture saying nowadays, um, that we as small churches particularly need to hear, need to be listening to, so that we can be caring of our community that's around us? And well, I'll let you run with that, Gwen.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that, the first step for me is that you recognize in the biblical culture or biblical text, one of the things that the authors were always doing was dialoguing with the culture, like
Mhm.
the backstory. I mean, you go to a book like Galatians or a book like Colossians, just to use that as an example. So why did Paul write Galatians the way he did? And why did he write Colossians the way he did? Well, the reason those are different books is because he's addressing different cultural issues. I mean, all the issues with the Jews and the Gentiles and freedom and bondage, that was the backstory and the cultural story behind Galatians. So he writes on that. And then in Colossians, you've got the Gnostics who thought, Jesus was acceptable and he was one of the ways to God,
Mhm.
but he wasn't the whole way to God. So in the culture, there was this very, poly view of gods. There were multiple gods, multiple ways to God. So in that culture, Paul writes. So I think the first step is sometimes right now there's a bit of a thread in Christian faith that we need to like push the culture away, not dialogue with it, not talk to them, get
Yep.
mad at it. And I don't think the biblical text would teach us that. I think we need to know the culture. And then, when Paul says in Colossians, all the fullness of God lives in bodily form, he's speaking directly to the Gnostics of that culture.
Mhm.
It's not an isolated verse. He's saying, no, Jesus is not one of the ways to God. He
Yes.
is the way to God. So he's kind of taking a shot at the culture. So I think that's one. We recognize the biblical text dialogues with culture and interacts with culture. So for me as a Christian, I think I want to understand God, I want to understand myself, and I want to understand the culture. And
Mhm.
so an exegesis, if you like to use that fancy word, of those three things is really important. Like it's what Calvin talked about, knowledge of self, knowledge of God are the two key pieces of knowledge, but I need to know the culture. So
Yep.
knowing it, believing it's important, I think that's the first step. And then I think the three options for me, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, the three options for me is you either give in to the culture and just act like the culture, and that's not Jesus' way. The Jesus way is countercultural. It's not
Mhm.
buying into it, number one. Number two, fight it and be mad at it and be angry at it. And every sermon's wailing away at the culture. I'm not sure that's a very effective strategy for dealing with the culture. For me, we need to, as Christians, embody an alternative. We need
Okay.
to live in a way that is respectful of people because they're all God's offspring, whatever they may believe, and learn to have conversation with them. So it's been kind of fun, Ron, with this book. When I wrote it, one of my goals was, could I give this to everybody in my townhouse building without feeling awkward that it's going to be, so theological or so biblical that people won't be able to understand it. So I'm having these great conversations in my townhouse, and people are saying to me, like, I'm not religious, but I'm really interested in your book. And one woman told me the other day, she said, I'm going to put a book club together in our townhouse so we can study your book together. Well,
Great.
That's exactly what I want to do with the culture. Like, she's not religious, she's not interested in anything Christian, but she's intrigued enough by my book that she wants to now have a book club that she's going to run. She didn't ask me to run it, she's going to run it. And I think that's going to bring these people closer to faith, closer to God. So if there's, I love Paul in Titus when he says we need to act in a way that makes the teaching about God our Savior attractive. And I think that's our task. We live our life wherever we are, in front of the culture, engaged with the culture, friends, whoever it may, people in our townhouse complex, but do that in a way that is winsome and attractive about the gospel. My neighbor next door, who lives a fairly immoral life, he said to me, you know what I do with your book? He said, I read a chapter of it every night before I go to bed. And, I'm thinking he's treating it as a devotional, like, and he has no interest in Christian faith at all, but somehow the book is allowing him. So I think all of us, I think everyone is listening, like your leaders and people who are involved in small church ministry. The opportunities are amazing if we understand the importance of having a winsome testimony in the culture.
Right. I would say one of the things about the structure of your book, and I've written some myself, I noted right away that you took, I would say, a chapter to introduce the next 20 narrative chapters. It's story, it's understanding of embodied life and what it's like, but nevertheless with an introduction that probably pulled it all together in one way. I just want to say I appreciated that style. You're an academic who uses stories, and okay, that's your pat in the back. And hey, I'm glad of what you're doing. It is great. So, by the way, anyone that wants to buy that book, please go ahead, do it. Rod will be glad, and you will be glad, very much so. Okay, I'm going to get back to a question that's been intriguing me as I read through this book. When don't we say sorry? And our Christian culture is in that. Well, you've talked a little bit about that idea of standing away or yelling at our culture and telling them how bad we are. When don't we say sorry?
Yeah. Well, I think, that's become very complex right now, because I think, a lot of people are offended, like not in the Romans 14 sense of offended, but in the offended, that's just become part of the culture. I mean, I remember growing up, when the only time I heard the word offended was in church when somebody was preaching from Romans 14. Now everybody's offended about everything. And I think there's a risk here where it almost feels like every sentence you say has to be followed by "I'm sorry," because somebody's going to be offended. and that extreme, I think, is really problematic. But I think, I would go to the biblical Greek word metanoia, which is the word, the English word for repentance. I think when we know we have wronged the other, when we know we have violated some standard, we've really hurt somebody, we've, been really critical of someone, we've misunderstood someone, we haven't treated them well, whatever that category may be, I think we do need to apologize. And sometimes, I know in parenting, this is a big issue, that I think sometimes, I remember early when my daughter was younger, the way I parented needed apology, but not what I was parenting about.
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes my daughter would act up or do something inappropriate, and I discipline her or, tell her she was wrong. And she was wrong and it was inappropriate, but the way I did it was inappropriate. So
Mhm.
sometimes we need to apologize for our method and for the way we do things, not just for what we do. So, the way, I mean, I grew up in a very, very conservative church and the world was a bad place. I mean, I remember
Mhm.
as a kid just thinking, oh, the world's a bad place. It's a terrible place. And you need to stay away from all those people in the world and you need to be negative on them and think they're all terrible. No teaching on everyone was God's offspring, no teaching that everyone's created in the image of God. And I think sometimes we do need to apologize as Christians for the way we have treated the other, the
Yeah.
way we have treated the non-Christian. I'm a big believer that you need to be not of the culture, but in the culture. Like I need to
Mhm.
be talking to my neighbors. Like when Jesus says, "Love your neighbor," it's the guy on the other side of this wall, right?
Yeah.
That's my neighbor. And he doesn't have a lifestyle I agree with. He doesn't have a way of being that's my way of being, but we need to be on a first name basis and have a relationship. So I think it's a tricky thing right now in the culture,
Right.
but I don't think we want to cheapen the phrase by just throwing it out. These press conferences with
Oh,
athletes, entertainers, they have serial affairs for 10 years and then stand up and say, "I'm sorry." It's like, well, like that doesn't count for much when you just say, "I'm sorry" publicly into a microphone after 10 years of infidelity.
mhm. Okay, I'm going to leave that and just finally, I'm looking at the clock here, and I'm saying we've got just a few minutes left, and I've got another intriguing question has come to mind as I read your book. Um, I listened to the phrases in my head, and I heard my mother,
Hmm.
which was a good thing
Yeah.
because she was teaching me how to live in a culture.
Yeah.
And she was teaching me as the authority to one in submission to, hopefully, at least she was hoping I would submit every once in a while. So, Ron, say thank you, say I'm sorry, uh, and then tell me a little bit more about what's going on. How come? How do we get to this? Tell me the
Yeah.
story of why you punched your sister.
Yeah.
It was very helpful.
Yeah.
And then I thought to myself, so what did I hear my father saying? Now, I heard my father say the same things,
Yeah.
but I also heard my father, who was in a position of authority and power in some of his work and other things. I heard him talk to me about how do I deal as a person with power.
Yeah.
And some of the things he would talk about were give more than you get, don't be stingy, um, and be humble. Don't exalt yourself. Don't make yourself a celebrity. Be with the people. And I'm just wondering if your next book is, you know, here's sayings my father talked about power. How do we, as people in power or authority, and there's many different ways in which we're in authority, and anyone can be in some kind of authority in
Yeah.
leadership.
Yeah.
Uh, Again, what type of phrases would a small church leadership need to have in hand? Yes, thank you, I'm sorry, tell me more. Are there other phrases that those in power might want to
Yeah.
incorporate?
Yeah.
Have you got your next book in line? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. um, yeah, interesting question. And I think you're right that, and let me sort of come at this a little different way. I
Okay.
think people in power, well, let me talk to pastors, okay? Because a lot of your listeners
Yes,
are
exactly.
pastors. I think pastors often pastor in a way that they think others should say thank you to them, and others should say, "I'm sorry," and others should say, "Tell me more."
Mhm.
And because they're a little higher up in the pecking order, they sort of feel like this should come up to them. And I think the Jesus way, the upside down kingdom, is pastors need to be thinking about, who can I say thank you to? Who can I say I'm sorry to? Who can I say tell me more to?
Mhm.
And so when you recognize you're in a position of power, one of the things that happens is a subtle entitlement.
Yes.
I've been a pastor, so I understand this. Like at the end of a service, I want people to appreciate me. I want people to thank me. I want people to say, "Tell me more" to me. And one of the things I've tried to practice in my own pastoral ministry is try to say those phrases down, say
Right.
them to others. I sometimes, when I've gone to a conference or something, I'll go to somebody in the break and I'll say, this is going to sound really weird to you, but I want to thank you for your face. And they always go, what? What do you mean?
Okay.
I said, well, I don't know anyone in this room. And, I'm speaking to this group of people and you have such a great face. Like you were following with me. You
Mhm.
laughed at the right times. I could tell you were listening. And I just want to tell you, thank you for your attentiveness. And people go, wow, like no one's
Yeah.
ever said that to me before. So I think when you're in power, Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians. Those of us in positions of power and authority have greater opportunities to encourage others.
Mhm.
So I would encourage your pastors to beware of the subtle entitlement in leadership that others need to do these things to us. We need to do it. Imagine if all the pastors in listening to this were to go to members of the congregation or maybe even the whole congregation and say some I'm sorry's.
Yeah.
That would really change the dynamic in the community.
Okay. Sorry, with that word, which is a marvelous, wise word, I'm going to say thank you. And we're going to have to cut this off. Maybe another time we'll get back together again. But thank you very much, Rod. This has been great.
Oh, you're very welcome, Ron. I appreciate being on, and I hope people would enjoy the book. Thank you. I'm sorry. Tell me more.
All right. Thanks
Yeah.
again.